Well, one of the questions is, what is white nationalism? I believe I answered that in the video. It has to do with people believing that they have unifying characteristics, that they have a shared interest, that they belong to a distinct group. And there's black nationalism, there's also Hispanic nationalism, lots of groups engage in racial pride. The question also asks, is there a place for white pride? And not in this society. If you begin to talk in terms of white pride, it automatically puts you into the ranks of people who are haters. That may not be fair, but the way identity politics is played out in America today, if you're white, it's best not to talk in terms of identity and in terms of pride. Yet, that is part of a grievance and part of what many people see as a double standard when it comes to multiculturalism. We know that in parts of the country, whites are already a minority, and by 2047, they will be a minority in the entire nation. And so if under multiculturalism, it argues that every group should be able to organize and celebrate its unique identity, then it's pretty hard to say every group except whites. And one of the questions that I was frequently asked was, what is the distinction between white nationalism and white supremacy? I'm going to read a little bit from the book. Here are some characteristics of the new white nationalism. One of the important distinctions is between the white supremacists and the white nationalists, and I would argue that the alt-right is just a rebranded, repackaged version of what I called the new white nationalists. The nationalists believe that they are not the same as the white supremacists because their focus is racial self-determination and self-preservation. And they use that language to argue that they have a God-given natural right to their distinct cultural, political, and genetic identity as white Europeans. They believe that multiculturalism and affirmative action threatens the existence of white people. And so these are individuals who are well educated. Some of them have Ivy League degrees. They're not espousing violence. They are not using racial epithets, but they argue that white is like any other group. If other groups can organize for self-determination and celebrate their pride, they would say that whites should be able to do the same. And some of their leaders are Jewish, as well as, of course, as well as white. And these are people who believe that white Americans need civil rights advocates to speak on their behalf. They also believe that whites are being discriminated against. And so they don't call themselves white supremacists because they're not trying to rule over other groups. If anything, many of them would prefer to separate from other groups. Another question, why does the left's packaging of white nationalism try to label Trump supporters as white nationalists? And I think it's because for political purposes, it serves an agenda to paint everyone with the same broad brush. And so when you use that broad brush, you're lumping in all sorts of people. You have the minuscule percentage of the population, at least when I was doing my study, who are white supremacists, who hate other groups. They hate blacks, they hate Jews, they hate Hispanics, they hate gays, they hate all kinds of people. And then you have a much larger group of people who claim to be concerned about white civil rights and discrimination against whites. And these are individuals who believe that white people need to behave more like racial and ethnic minorities when it comes to having leaders and articulating a set of interests. And then you have your everyday people, I would say, that we see at the grocery store, we go to church with. They're just trying to make a living. They don't hate anyone. They may use part of their time working in minority communities, yet they are concerned about the future. They have children, and they see a system that they believe is unfair. I think a lot of those people voted for Donald Trump, not because they hated people of other races, but they felt like he cared about people like them. Another question, what exactly is white privilege? Well, people who argue about white privilege would say that just having white skin itself is something that elevates every white person above every racial or ethnic minority. You know, it's more of the nonsense that comes out of universities. And as I said in the longer video, tell that, you know, to J.D. Vance's relatives, tell that to the poor whites in Appalachia and in parts of the country who are suffering. There is black privilege as well as some white privilege, but I think that the vast majority of people are not privileged. They're just trying to make a living in a society where it's being taught at colleges and universities, if you have white skin, you're privileged. And if you have black skin, no matter how much money you have, or brown skin, that you're at a disadvantage. And it's also being taught, and it's been taught for decades, since I started graduate school, that it is impossible for minorities to be racist, because to be racist, you have to have power, and that whites have all the power. That's very difficult to argue in a nation that has elected a black president, has had two black attorney generals, have black people in positions of power for many decades. Clearly, black people have and have had power in America, even though the vast majority of blacks are not doing so well. The last question, is it possible for a black person to have pride in a Southern heritage without embracing sinful behavior? Is Southern heritage equivalent to racism? And if so, how do Southerners break this identity? I think it is possible for a black person to have Southern pride. There are black Confederates, there are a lot of people who are proud of being Southerners. I was born and raised in Virginia. I'm proud to be a Virginian. And I know that, you know, my state has had at times a pretty dark history, aspects of it that's been dark, but altogether, you know, I care about my nation. And I think that the South has a history just like the North and other parts of the nation, and that instead of trying to erase our histories, we should try to study and learn from the lessons of the past. I also believe that it is a big mistake to judge historical figures by the standards that we hold today. The major finding of my book, The New White Nationalism in America, was that there were 7 conditions that I felt threatened to fuel the growth of the race consciousness among whites in the future. And remember, this book was published in 2002. And these conditions included the growing presence of non-white immigrants, both legal and illegal, resulting in the fact that whites would become a minority in the not too distant future. There were concerns about the structural changes in the global economy that have led to the loss of high-wage production jobs and created fewer opportunities for unskilled workers. There was a continuing concern about racial preferences and their perceived unfairness towards whites, and also their constitutionality. There was concerns about high black-on white violent crimes, and there was also a growing acceptance of multiculturalism and identity politics. Those arguments were being used to justify white people organizing and identifying along the same lines as other racial and ethnic groups. There was also, at the time, the early 1990s, the internet was really taking off, and so the internet was offering the opportunity for like-minded people to organize. In the past, if you were interested in white extremism, maybe you'd go to a rally, you know, maybe you would associate and really risk losing your job. The internet made it possible for individuals in the privacy of their own homes to connect with others and to feed, whatever concerns they had or whatever ideas they had, they could find the literature that would reinforce what they were believing or what they were seeking, and that was a new factor because it allowed like-minded people to find each other. And so these were among some of the conditions that were converging to create, in my mind, a devil's brew for racial unrest. I thank you for taking the time to watch the video. I hope you will consult the volumes, The New White Nationalism in America, Its Challenge to Integration, the companion volume, Contemporary Voices of White Nationalism, so that you will be more fully informed. And again, I believe that the way we get away from the racial turmoil, the tension, the hatred that we see coming from many different sides is that we embrace our Americanism. We move away from the identity politics. And that is the way that we will save our nation. Thank you.